Hey BookTube, how is it going? So I come to you with my second Friday reads of my comeback era on BookTube. I missed the Friday reads last week because I spent the weekend, Memorial Day weekend, at my family's cabin in the Adirondacks, and up in the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. My mom's family has a lovely little cabin, and we spent the weekend up there. My parents were there, my brother and sister-in-law, and my two nieces were there. We had a lovely Memorial Day weekend. I had been planning to do a Friday Reads last week because I was expecting that Wi-Fi would be set up at the cabin. For decades before this, there was never any internet at the cabin, but recently we have actually pushed to try to get Wi-Fi there. But the Wi-Fi did not get set up for one reason and another, so I was not really able to record or post a video. And so unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess depending on your outlook, I kind of have 2 weeks worth of reading to cover in this Friday Reads. So I'm going to try to go at a pace, and I'm going to try to focus on the books that I finished. I'm going to start with that. I'm going to start with both books that I finished this week. I finished 2 books this week, both of which I've mentioned before. The first book that I finished, and I actually finished it while I was up in the Adirondacks for my little vacation, I finished Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. It takes place in sort of a near-ish future United States, in which a couple developments have occurred. For one thing, gene editing has become widely used, so families will actually have their children gene edited, so they'll have their genes edited, in particular to enhance their academic ability. But more directly relevant to the events of the story, a lot of families, wealthy families, will buy these android artificial intelligence, sort of artificial humans, they're called artificial friends, to basically be company for their children. So in this near future, a lot of life is virtual, right? The novel was written, I assume a lot of it was written not long after the pandemic began, the COVID-19 pandemic, and so I think it was inspired by that. But in this near future, a lot of life is lived in sort of remote contexts, right? Doing things over Zoom, as we'd say now. They don't refer to Zoom in the novel, but things like that, right? School is over Zoom. Business is done over virtually, and so on. And so a lot of young people grow up feeling very lonely and don't necessarily have the social skills that they might otherwise have had in back when society was more interactive. And so a lot of families hire these artificial friends, as they're called, to basically keep their children company. And the novel is about an artificial friend, they're called, AF, named Klara, Klara of the title, who is bought by a woman to be the companion of her daughter named Josie, who is in her early teens, it seems. It seems like she's 14, 15, maybe 13 at the youngest. So the mother buys Klara to be a companion for Josie. Josie has had gene editing done on her, and in the context of this world, that's referred to as being lifted. And one of the side effects of gene editing, in some cases at least, is that the child actually becomes sickly. Right? So editing some of the genes that have to do with intelligence in this universe apparently can also end up editing some of the genes that have to do with susceptibility to illnesses. Right? And so Josie, the girl that Klara is supposed to be the companion of, is really, really sick. And it's strongly suggested that her mother and her father later don't really think she's going to live very long. And so Klara is bought to be the companion of Josie. And that's kind of where the story moves forward from. All right? There is much more to it. We get a lot of insight into both Josie and Klara, of course. Klara being by far the most fascinating character, but also Josie's mother, and also Josie's sort of boyfriend, childhood friend named Rick, who's her neighbor. And then also Josie's father, and also one other character who I won't mention because it's a bit of a spoiler. And so if I were to reveal more about the plot, it would be a serious spoiler. And another aspect of the story that is really interesting and kind of the inspiration for the title, Klara and the Sun, is that Klara and all AFs are actually solar powered. So they take their energy from the sun. And so Klara actually views the sun as this kind of quasi-divine being, right? She actually prays to the sun. She actually beseeches the sun. So she sees the sun as almost like God. So there's a lot to chew on in this novel, right? Some of the biggest aspects, as you might imagine, in a story about artificial intelligence is the nature of being human, all right? There's this really fascinating theme that comes forward in the second half about what makes an individual person their individual self, right? Like, what makes me Lukash? What makes me me, right? Is there some kind of inherent aspect to myself that makes me Lukash, that is unable to be mimicked or exchanged? Or is who I am as a person just made up of, like, my mannerisms and my speech patterns and my interests, right? Or is there some kind of basically soul, right? Or Ghost in the Shell is what I thought of. I thought of the film Ghost in the Shell, the really great anime film from the 90s, which deals with very similar themes. All right, so a theme that pops up is what makes an individual their individual self, right? Is there some core at the heart of them that one can't mimic, or are they just made up of these sort of superficial cues to who they are, right? And then another theme that really struck me, and these aren't the only two themes I will say, but they're the two that I feel most interested in talking about. The second theme, I think, was kind of religion, weirdly. I wasn't expecting this book to seem to be kind of about religion, right? But the way that Klara views the sun as this divine being comes to kind of, I think, have some interesting commentary on religion, on religiosity. Even though Klara isn't even ostensibly a human being. Sorry, we have the cat knocking down the camera. She's not even ostensibly a human being, right? But there's some really interesting, I think, commentary on religion through her relationship to the sun, right? She at one point wants to make a sacrifice to the sun in order to get the sun to save Josie, right? And that was a really fascinating dynamic, right? But what's interesting too is she never tells anyone else about what she's doing with the sun, that she's making this sacrifice to the sun. All right, people do help her, but she never explains fully what she's doing. And I'm speaking a little bit vaguely because, again, I don't want to spoil things, but that reminded me a lot of another film, The Sacrifice, a great Andrei Tarkovsky film. And I might rewatch that film soon, inspired by Klara and the Sun. But to say the least, I was not expecting to be kind of comparing this to The Sacrifice of all films at the end. And so anyway, Klara and the Sun I thought was magnificent. I absolutely loved it. It was kind of devastating at the end. Again, I really don't want to spoil things. It was devastating at the end. I love the first-person narration. It actually reminded me a lot of Never Let Me Go, right? For, I think, pretty obvious reasons. But it also actually reminded me a little bit of The Remains of the Day, because it's kind of in a way about a domestic worker, right? AFs are kind of like domestic workers, a little bit like the protagonist in The Remains of the Day was. So anyway, I really adored this. I think it's probably my second favorite Ishiguro after The Remains of the Day. So that's Klara and the Sun. Love to hear anyone's thoughts on this if they've read it, which I assume a lot of you have. So there's that. Okay, next book I finished this week is Queer by William S. Burroughs. So this is such a different animal from Klara and the Sun. So this is a novel that takes place in the 1950s in Mexico City. It's about a man named William Lee who is my understanding is taken to basically be a stand-in for William S. Burroughs himself. William S. Burroughs, much like sort of Jack Kerouac and some of the other of the beat generations of writers, wrote a lot of fiction that was sort of thinly veiled autobiography, and this very much is like that. I think there are people who do view it almost as a quasi-memoir. But the main character is this semi-fictionalized William S. Burroughs named William Lee, who is living in Mexico City, and he's gay. He's a gay man living in Mexico City, and so at the beginning of the novel, or novella I really would call it, we see him just living the life of a gay man in the 1950s in Mexico City, right? Seeking out sexual partners, going to gay bars, talking to his other queer friends, and so on. And then what sort of is the main action, or the main plot, to the extent there's much of a plot in this, is that William Lee is attracted to this younger man named Eugene, or Gene, he's usually called, Eugene Allerton, who's another American, and who at first he's not even sure is queer, but finds out that he seems to be queer. And so the novella becomes more about William and Gene's relationship as it develops, right? So William takes this interest in Gene and sort of courts him in a way, and eventually Gene succumbs to his advances. There are a couple of strengths and weaknesses to Queer for me. So one thing that I really, really like about it is that it is kind of a snapshot of what gay life was like before the gay liberation movement, at least in Mexico City, at least for American immigrants in Mexico City, which I always find really fascinating. I really find the world of gay life before the gay liberation movement really, really interesting. How people express themselves, how they found partners, how they found dates, how they found their community. Because they did do that before the gay liberation movement. It wasn't like before the gay liberation movement, everyone was in the closet and everyone was repressed, even though a lot of people obviously were. There were people who pushed back against the social norms and were able to live a sort of quasi-queer life before gay liberation was really a thing. And so I found that really, really interesting. Another thing that I really liked about it was that it was kind of a hangout novel, right? I'm a big fan of hangout movies, right? Movies by directors like Richard Linklater and these others. Movies where people just kind of sit around and talk and drink and sometimes do drugs and so on. I'm a really big fan of those kinds of movies. I'm not really sure why. And so I really enjoyed that piece as well. The piece in the novel about William Lee's desire for Gene Allerton as well, I found really powerful, right? And another interesting aspect of the book is Gene Allerton himself, right? This young man who, at the beginning of the novel, you get the sense doesn't even quite realize he's queer, and even after he starts his relationship with William Lee, he seems extremely ambivalent about William and his own sexuality, right? So he kind of puts on this show of not really wanting to have sex with William Lee, but doing it because William insists, you know? And also kind of acts emotionally very distant for much of the story. And so I see in that a lot of ambivalence from Allerton, right? Because there's also suggestion that he does very much is queer, right? That he is attracted to William Lee. Otherwise, presumably, he would not have first, gone to bed with him, started dating him, right? And so those aspects that I found interesting. The thing is that the problem for me with this book is that I feel like it is a little bit directionless, a little bit resolutionless, all right? So late in the story, what becomes a big thread of the plot is William Lee and Allerton go to Ecuador to seek out a drug called yahe, which is more widely known as ayahuasca. And Lee is interested in it because supposedly it gives telepathic abilities. And so Allerton and Lee go to Ecuador seeking it out, and a lot of the novel is just their sort of travels down to Ecuador. And then they I don't want to spoil things, but there's not much to spoil. But that ending, the way it ends, it does basically end during this quest for Yahei. It feels like the book just kind of peters out more than it concludes, right? There's really no resolution. And you know, for me, I don't need a story to have like a concrete plot resolution. But I like it when a story at least seems to have a thematic resolution. And I just felt like this really didn't have a thematic resolution, which kind of made it feel very incomplete. And my understanding is that this novel is kind of incomplete. So William S. Burroughs actually wrote it in the 1950s, 60s, sort of roughly that era, but didn't publish it, couldn't get it published because it's about being queer. And so he didn't publish it until about 1985, I believe. And because when he first wrote it, it couldn't get published, it is kind of incomplete, right? And there's a very interesting introduction to this book by Oliver Harris. And there's a short introduction actually by William S. Burroughs himself as well. But you learn a lot in particular in the introduction by Oliver Harris about the textual history of queer and how it is kind of a thrown together book because of its publication history and its textual history. So, you know, it was interesting, but it felt more like a start to a book rather than a full book. I felt like it needed at least like 50 more pages to make this a satisfying story. So I liked a lot of it. There were a lot of really striking passages. In particular, at times, there are these sort of surreal passages. There's one particularly interesting piece where William Lee envisions like a giant centipede, and that's kind of cool. But on the whole, this was a little bit underwhelming. I liked it. I could see myself reading more William S. Burroughs, and I think I will. I think I will at least read Junky, which was the book that he published before Queer, and Naked Lunch, I think, sounds really interesting as well. I'm not sure when I'll get to those, but I think I'd be interested in reading them. Okay, so I've talked about the 2 books that I finished this week. Now on to everything else, basically. Starting with the volume of poetry that I'm making my way through. This is Our Andromeda by Brenda Shaughnessy. I guess I didn't really get a chance to talk about this book before because I didn't get it out from the library until after my last Friday reads, when I chatted a little bit about what I might start reading. And at that point, I was not planning to read this, but I ended up checking it out from the library on a bit of a whim and starting to get through it. I'm about halfway through, right? Our Andromeda is longer than a lot of poetry collections, a lot of individual poetry collections. It's about 130 pages, and I'm used to individual poetry collections usually capping off their length at about 100 pages or even 90 pages. So it's actually a bit lengthier for an individual volume of poetry, even though it's still obviously quite slim. Brenda Shaughnessy's poems are, I think, kind of deceptively simplistic. When you look at them on the page, they look very simple. They're often written in very formalized stanzas, like in triplets or in quatrains or in sextets or something. And they even have a certain rhyme scheme, some of them. So they have this veneer of simplicity to them. Some of them even sound a little bit like nursery rhymes. And she even, at a couple points, I think, alludes to certain nursery rhymes or children's songs. But they're kind of deceptively simple. I find that a lot of them I have to reread to try to digest them a little bit more. And that's interesting. I do kind of like deceptively simple works, but I'm not entirely certain I'm getting a ton out of all of them. The reason I picked this book up was because of the first poem in it, which is called Artless, which I was just so taken by. You know, what I loved about it was that the title, Artless, is actually kind of the first line, right? So the poem begins, "Artless is my heart, a stranger berry there never was, tartless, gone sour in the sunroom or moon roofless. No poetry, plain, no fresh, special recipe to bless. right? It has an incredible rhythm to it, right? And you can kind of see some rhymes, some internal rhymes, but no poem in here has quite struck me the way Artless has. There have been some that I've liked, but I'm not entirely certain how I'm going to feel about this when I finish. But it is interesting. So there's that. Okay, next is A Monster. I've talked about this book, Christianity, The First 3,000 Years by Diarmaid MacCulloch. So what I'm loving about this book, I'm approaching the 300-page mark of about 1,000 pages in total in this. What I'm particularly liking about this is his coverage of corridors of Christian history that I think a lot of people just don't know very much about. Okay, so things like Ethiopian Christianity. Right? Ethiopia is one of the oldest Christian countries in the world, but a lot of people don't know that and don't know a lot about Ethiopian Christianity. And what's interesting is that Ethiopian Christianity is so different and from Christianity in pretty much any other place, and is so odd in many ways to an outsider's perspective, right? So Ethiopian Christianity he covers. He talks about Christianity in India as well, as in particular the state of Kerala, where there's still a pretty significant Christian minority, but also Christianity in China, right? I didn't know that there was a kind of a small but significant Chinese Christian minority for many centuries back in the Tang Dynasty in the Middle Ages, the Middle and so-called Dark Ages. There was a Christian community in China. Okay, and he talks about these like corridors of Christian history that I think I just haven't learned very much about, and I get the sense that a lot of people don't know very much about. And I'm really loving that aspect of it. But he's about to, in the section I've just reached, he's about to return to more kind of mainstream Christian history. He's about to talk about, the name of the next section is The Unpredictable Rise of Rome. Okay, so he's just getting to talking about the rise of Rome, not as an empire, but as a critical center of Catholicism, right? So I'm certain that will also be utterly fascinating. So this is great. Eloquence on every page, insights on every page, loving it. So I may not talk about this book in so much depth every week, but really, really liking this. Okay, next book is a complete change in tone. I've been working my way through The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. I don't want to talk about this too much because I feel like it would get overwhelming. This volume has an introduction by Cornel West, a foreword by Homi Bhabha, and a preface by Jean-Paul Sartre, all of which were kind of interesting in their way, but also a little bit underwhelming. The actual text of The Wretched of the Earth is much more interesting than those, I think. I'm a little bit surprised by this. I was expecting it to be a lot more academic. I was also expecting it to be a little bit more like a work of history. I was expecting a little bit more historical detail about decolonization movements, about movements to throw off colonial rule in many countries. And there isn't very much of that. There's a few pieces that he mentions, but there's not a lot of it. For the most part, this reads like kind of like a speech more than an academic work or something like that. It reads like a speech. It almost reads as a little bit biblical. It almost reads a little bit like those Old Testament prophets who I'm reading through right now. Right, and so he talks about kind of the process by which colonies come to a violent resistance movement to overthrow colonial rule. Okay, that's kind of what he's going through. And it's interesting. I don't know that I'm learning a whole lot, but I am liking the writing. Again, it has kind of this biblical Old Testament prophet kind of speech-like style that I do find really interesting. I imagine it's interesting to read in the original French, which I unfortunately cannot do. But yeah, I think that's all I'll say about The Wretched of the Earth for now, just because, again, I've already talked about a lot of other books in a lot of depth, and this one can get a little bit overwhelming. So, Wretched of the Earth, a little bit more mixed, but liking it. That's a buddy read, by the way, with Patrice from 2 Minutes on Books, so just shouting her out. And then a book that I started just yesterday as my new kind of main read is a nonfiction book. This is actually a biography. This is a Marsha, The Joy and Defiance of Marsha P. Johnson by Tourmaline, and the author's name is just Tourmaline. And so Marsha P. Johnson, if you're not aware of who she was this black trans drag queen who was really critical in the Stonewall riots, which kind of initiated the gay liberation movement. And then she went on to be an extremely important leader in the gay liberation movement through the 1970s to her death in the early 1990s. So she was important in particular to supporting trans youths, right? She also was a big advocate for HIV/AIDS intervention. She herself lived with HIV for the last years of her life. She's gotten a lot more attention in recent years, I think, for what she did for the gay liberation movement than she had before. And so this is kind of the first full biography of her. And Tourmaline herself is actually known more as an activist than as a writer. And Tourmaline herself is also a black trans woman. And so I'm about 40 pages into it. I am liking it so far. Again, I'm sort of at the stage in the biography where Marsha's just growing up as sort of figuring out her identity as a trans woman. And we're at the stage in her life too that's before Stonewall, right? And again, I'm very interested in kind of what pre-Stonewall queer life was like. And so that's all interesting. I do have some reservations about this book so far, but I will hold off on those until next week again, because I've already talked about Queer and Klara and the Sun in such depth that I just wanted to point out that I'm reading this. I'm liking it so far. I think I'm going to learn a lot from it. And I will talk about it more in depth next Friday. I think I'll probably finish it by next Friday. It's not a long book. So that's what I'm chipping away at. And then the last two books I'm chipping away at, I don't have huge updates on these. I have the collected poems of Sylvia Plath, and I'm still reading through the Book of Jeremiah in the King James Bible. Two diametrically different works. Although the Book of Jeremiah has a lot of poetry in it, a lot of lovely poetry, which I guess kind of connects to Sylvia Plath. But I think the Sylvia Plath is starting to show. I'm in the year 1959 with her works. This collected poems is arranged chronologically, and I'm in the year 1959, and I think she's starting to show a lot more of that Plath fire that I expect from her. I may try to do a Sylvia Plath poem for a Poetry Thursday. Either of one of the classics that I know well, or maybe one of the newer ones I've discovered, I'm not sure. But I think this is starting to pick up much better. You know, I'm just over a third of the way through it. So I'm excited to get more into sort of the classics and her at the height of her powers. And then the Book of Jeremiah is really interesting. You know, these Old Testament prophets can be very repetitive, but I think I do find them interesting, in particular Jeremiah interesting as a commentary on society letting down the most marginalized in society, right? So a lot of Jeremiah's message seems to be about how the Israelites were not doing well by the marginalized and the needy and the vulnerable in their society. It seems like that's a theme that pops up in the Book of Jeremiah, and that's part of why the prophet says that they will get punished. Okay, and I find that really interesting and very relevant. One of the things that motivated me to reread the Book of Jeremiah was because of how important it was, from what I remember, to Frederick Douglass, because he, of course, was a big advocate for social justice, abolitionism, feminism, so on and so forth. And he took a lot of inspiration from the Book of Jeremiah for, I think, rather similar reasons. And so that's probably the piece of it I'm finding the most interesting. But, I mean, the King James Bible is just beautiful, of course. So I'm just trying to sort of, enjoy the language, the English language in it, because it is, of course, one of the most exquisite works of literature in English. And you don't really need me to tell you that. But, so, anyway. So that's my Friday reads. Please let me know if you've read these books and have thoughts on them, or if you haven't read them and have thoughts about anything else I've discussed. I will leave it at that. I hope you all enjoyed. You all have a great weekend. Happy almost Pride Month. We'll definitely hit different this year, and I'm debating talking about that a little bit more on my channel, but happy almost Pride Month, and I'll talk to you all again soon. Bye.